So today we sit down with one of Australia's most enduring and visionary entrepreneurs, Malcolm Steinberg, Chairman and Founder of Leisure and Allied Industries. Thank you very much for your time this morning, Malcolm. Take us back to your childhood in Perth, if we could, to start in the 1940s and 50s, and add a little bit of colour to your family history, if you could.
Yeah, well, I was born in Perth, Perth born and bred. I attended primary school and high school in Highgate in North Perth, and then went on to, in those days it was Perth Boys High School. I wasn't a very good scholar, I must admit, and so I left school at the age of 16, trying to find a place in the commercial world. I wanted to get a job in a bank, but you couldn't get a job in a bank unless you were educated to at least what is now the equivalent of year 12. So my dad got me a job with one of the accounting firms as an audit clerk. And I used to go out with the auditor, and there were no computers in those days, obviously. And he'd call out numbers and I'd tick them off a paper ledger, and every now and again he'd deliberately call out a wrong number, I'd still tick it off. And so I realised that wasn't for me. And then I went to work for my dad, who had a furniture business, and tried to convince him that he had it all wrong. And after a few months, he said, "Son, maybe you should find something else." So that's the base, an outline of my childhood. And then I decided to take a trip to Melbourne with a friend and while I was there in Melbourne, an uncle of mine who lived in Newcastle called me and said, "Would you like to come up and visit the family for the weekend?" I said, "Yeah, sure." So I went up there. I didn't know he was in the games business. Anyhow, the weekend turned into 3 months, and I came back to Perth with 21 pinball machines in April 1958, and that's how I got into this business.
Before we get into that, a little bit about your family history. Your mother, Malka Steinberg's journey from Russia to Western Australia is obviously a remarkable one and a pivotal one in terms of the influence in your life. Tell us about sort of her resilience and her spirit.
Well, Malka Stein was actually my paternal grandmother, and my mother was actually born in Perth also. But she fled Russia at the time of the Tsar and went to Palestine. And she met my grandfather there, who had also come from Russia. And the two of them migrated to Australia in 1910, when my dad was only 2 years old. And she was really the entrepreneur of the family. She used to buy up old houses and renovate them and rent them out. And then she'd build them up and take a capital profit and buy another one or two houses. And anyhow, she finished up owning about 6 or 7 houses by the time she was 40. And then regrettably and tragically, she went into hospital for a minor procedure and died at the age of 40. So I've always thought that she is the entrepreneurial spirit within my family. So that's why we named our family PAF after her. Yeah.
You mentioned it earlier. I think at 18 years old in 1958, you acquired your uncle's 21 pinball machines, and so began Amusement Games Company. Take us inside running your own business at 18 years old. I think you had these pinball machines in fish and chip shops and pubs and things like that. Tell us about those early days.
Yeah, that's right. You know, in those days, the machines were operated on revenue sharing arrangements in fish and chip shops and fast food outlets and pubs and some clubs, because the modern day family entertainment centre really hadn't been developed at that point in time. So that's what I used to do. I operated. My grandfather on my mother's side was a contract painter, and he had a big workshop at the back of his house. He'd retired, so I operated from that old workshop, which was quite small. But that's where we were for the first several years, building up the business. It started with just myself and one other technician, and we built it from there.
Tell us about particularly those early days. I mean, would have been a relatively gritty industry. You're going around servicing machines, collecting cash. How did you you go about, building it from 21 pinball machines up and starting to employ staff as well?
Well, it really started when the fast food industry started to develop. The McDonald's and Hungry Jack's and KFC's, and I could see what a difference they made to the restaurant industry. They were a big shift from the fast food outlet, greasy hamburger places, and the fish and chip shops. And I thought, well, our industry really doesn't have a particularly good image. So maybe that's what we need to look at. And that's where the ideas started coming up. And we started experimenting with that type of operation in the early 1970s. And it took about 7 or 8 years to get the concept right. We traded under various other different brands and names. But in 1978, we opened the first Timezone. So that was a major turning point in the business, because the prior operation of operating games in different venues got very competitive, very cutthroat, and moving into the family area where you could have large scale operations in one venue was a major turning point for us.
Tell us about the very first Timezone, which, if I'm not mistaken, was in Murray Street here in Perth, 1978. How did that concept come about?
Well, actually, my father owned the property, and it was a Salvation Army. It was leased to a Salvation Army gift store, and they vacated the lease. So I decided to build a Timezone there, and that was the first one under that brand. We had several other different brands beforehand, but that was the first one.
What was your vision for Timezone in those initial days?
Well, it was mainly focused on Perth, and it was only when the concept succeeded that I started to think about expanding it into the eastern states. And that happened, I think, it would have been in the early 80s that we first went to Adelaide, and then Melbourne, and then Brisbane, and then Sydney. So it was a gradual process, really through 1978 through pretty much till the 90s that we developed the Australian market.
What were some of the challenges that you encountered, particularly expanding into the east and into markets like Brisbane or Adelaide?
Yeah, look, it wasn't easy, because at that time the shopping centre developers didn't really like the idea, and it was very hard to get space. It's quite the reverse now. They queue up to rent a space. But in those days, there was a fair amount of pushback, and therefore the space we got was sort of second tier or third tier space within the centre. And it was only after time that the developers realised that this was a popular destination for families that they started to take more notice of us.
What about then in terms of funding the business and expanding it? Did you bring on any external shareholders, or how did you sort of manage the actual structure of the business in terms of the growth?
No, it was all funded out of its own cash flow and bank loans. At that time, we managed to get enough capital together to grow the business at the rate it was growing. That changed, of course, in 2018, but right up until then, it was pretty much self-funded.
So you obviously had a terrific run from, call it, the late 70s up until sort of the mid-1990s or late 1990s. Then along comes sort of e-gaming, online gaming, digital disruption. What sort of impact did that have, and then how did you manage to turn around the business?
Yeah, well, it's certainly starting in the late 70s when the first home console game, which was the game Pong, which you had a little console you plugged in your TV. I could see that really developing. Up until then, if you wanted to play an interactive game, the only place you could play it was at Timezone or a similar location because there were no home games. So we were 100% of the market. But that started to change rapidly. So I knew Australia would embrace the home game system. So we decided to look to Asia as a secondary market where we could develop our family entertainment centres, and the impact of the home game market would be slower, less felt. So that's what we did.
I think you've spoken previously, and I've read previously that the business actually, it grew in Australia and then it sort of shrunk before growing again after the Asia expansion, in which time you started developing your own gaming software and expanding into other areas. How concerned were you during that time, or were you just confident that the overseas expansion into Asia would sort of save the business, as it were?
Yeah, look, I knew that the home game market would impact Asia as well. But in the long term, it's a basic human instinct to want to congregate in public forums for social interaction. That's why we have so many restaurants when every household has a kitchen. That's just a natural part of human nature. So I knew that we'd be able to claw back. And we have. It has clawed back. It was a tough few years, between in the 80s and 90s. It was pretty tough going, and it wasn't until after the turn of the century that it started to turn around again.
How did you adapt Timezone for different cultures? Did the preferences in Australian and sort of Asia Pacific markets change to what they might have been overseas?
Yeah, well, the focus was on ambience and customer service. So you had to create an environment which was conducive for families and friends to congregate and ensure that they had a very impressive experience. And that's where the focus was. And then, of course, the ongoing driver was improved and renewed content, which came in the form of new games and new programs. And that's been the main driver of the industry. I guess you could use the cinema industry as an analogy. If you had a cinema that played the same movie forever, they wouldn't have very many patrons after a few months. So we drive our business by continually introducing new content and using technology and customer relationship management to improve the experience continuously.
As you know, the entertainment sector is famously vulnerable to fads and tech shifts. How did you know which games would perform well and which games you'd have to get rid of after a couple of months?
Yeah, that's a good question because it varies. Some games, like movies, they're gone in 10 or 12 weeks. But others go on for years. It's really quite remarkable. It's just a matter of we have a process where we test the games before we commit to any quantity of them, and we measure customer reaction to it, and then decide what the likely life of the game would be, useful life of the game would be, and we make decisions accordingly.
Timezone was and still is a household name. One of the big aspects to it that I recall is the loyalty programs and the Timezone card that you would have and use on your birthday and things like that. Where did you get the inspiration for looking at things like that, loyalty programs, customer data, digital payment systems, and so on?
Yeah, well, back in the early 2000s, I think 2003, we were still operating on coins and tokens. And it was very difficult to keep abreast of inflation doing that because normally, at that time, I think it was like 20 cents a game, and to increase the price, you'd have to use 2 coins, which was a 100% increase. So we decided we had to have a payment system. So my son travelled the world looking for a digitised payment system. He found one, but it was too expensive, so we decided to develop our own. And that system is the basis of which we use to market our our business, because we can use it to vary the price, discount it in slow times, use it to make offerings. It's a very, very flexible system. And that card system finished up spinning off into a separate business, which is now the world's largest provider of card systems and management systems for our industry.
And then if we look at sort of the last decade or two in terms of the business's evolution, how have you seen that from your perspective?
The business was still growing, but the rate of growth increased to the point where it got difficult to raise capital, because every time you open a new venue, it's like $3 million. It was in 2017 that we decided we need to bring in more capital into the business, and that's when we started having talks with Quadrant Private Equity, and they came in 2018 as a 50-50 partner, and were able to provide the capital we needed to grow the business. It helped not only, at that stage we were already operating in countries outside of Australia, but that allowed us to dramatically increase the growth rate in those markets and also enter new markets like Vietnam, which we did after 2018.
The Entertainment and Education Group, TAAG, which you're a 50% partner of alongside Quadrant Private Equity, the deal with QPE, what drew you to Chris Hadley and JP, who's obviously no longer there, but Chris in particular?
Yeah. Well, actually, we first met Chris 10 years earlier, and he was interested at that time, but for circumstances at the time, it wasn't right for us. So because I was aware of them, we had a good experience negotiating in 2007. I just automatically went back to them and opened discussions. We did speak to others, but there seems to be a good chemistry. He's a very good person to do business with. His words, his bond, and we've had a wonderful relationship over the last several years.
Tell us about that business today, the Entertainment and Education Group. Where's the growth coming from, and how do you see the next sort of 5 or 10 years?
Well, it's still growing. The interesting thing when it comes to food, shelter, and clothing, everybody they're necessities of life. So if you look at those industries throughout the world, they've all developed to pretty close to the same amount. But entertainment isn't a necessity of life. So you get the US, which is the most developed market, that has one family entertainment centre per 55,000 people, as opposed to the other end, India, which was the last to develop. It has one entertainment centre per 5.3 million people. So there's a big disparity in the saturation levels. So that's why, India right now is by far our fastest growing market. And there are even, markets like Europe, they're comparatively underdeveloped because the European market developed more on the gambling side of things, where we call them poker machines, they call them AWPs. They developed in pubs and clubs, but they've now had their day. And if you look at pure family entertainment centres, even the whole of Europe, which has 850 million people, there's only one per 800,000 people. It's pretty unsaturated, shall we say? So we think there's a lot of growth in our existing markets. Australia is relatively mature, although we're at 120,000, so we're still half as saturated as the US. But certainly some of these other markets have enormous potential for growth.
How do you see the dynamic of family entertainment centres, as you call them, today? There's still the prevalence of online gaming and PlayStations and Xboxes, but has there been a shift back to Timezone for, you know, kids' parties and things like that? Because it is social and it's away from just being at screens at home.
Yeah, there's been a huge growth in the party business at both Timezone and Zone Bowling, and the third brand we operate here in Australia called Kingpin. It's not in Perth, it's coming. And that's been a major venue for parties. So that's certainly a big growth market, or big section of our business. I think it accounts for about 20% of our revenue, parties.
Tell me about LAI Games, which, as I understand, it's your in-house games supplier. When did you realise that there was an opportunity to manufacture and export arcade machines and games yourself?
Yeah, well, back in the 1970s, we got into the distribution side of the business, selling games to our competitors. And there was a fair demand at the time, so we decided that we'd start building them. So we built them under license from American and Japanese developers. And then we saw an opportunity to develop our own intellectual property, design our own games, because we've had so much experience at the retail level, if you like. We thought we had a skill to develop that, and that started in the 80s. And that's grown. LAI Games is a wholly owned subsidiary of the LAI Group, and that's now based in Singapore. It's got a factory in Indonesia, got a big design team based in Singapore, another team in Indonesia. And in 2023, we were the second largest supplier of arcade games in the US market. So it's been a pretty successful business in terms of developing its ability to build intellectual property internally.
What were the challenges that you encountered in terms of building Timezone and the broader business from here in Australia, and specifically from here in Perth when you're expanding internationally? Has that been something that has been difficult to sort of navigate over the years?
Look, it was easier. You know, one thing we found that our first offshore effort was in Singapore, and I remember I'd stopped off in Singapore on a trip back from London, and amusement arcades had been banned in Singapore under Lee Kuan Yew, and Go Chok Tong had recently stepped up after Lee Kuan Yew retired. And I happened to be walking down Orchard Road and I saw an amusement arcade and I was amazed. And so I started making inquiries and I found out that Go Chok Tong, as the new Prime Minister, had a different view. So I contacted, this was the first, it had only just opened. So I contacted our manager in Sydney. I said, how'd you like to live in Singapore for a while? We'd like to set up an operation. He said, oh, good. He said, it'll take me about 2 weeks to get my affairs together and I'll be up there. And by the time we got up there were 13 in operation in 2 weeks. So we learned a lesson about what competition really looks like in a very competitive market. And that's been a good lesson because when we went from there a couple of years later into Indonesia, we were prepared for that, as we did in the Philippines and other countries, because Asia, in terms of competition, is much more aggressive than this country, which is good in a way, but it's bad for Australia, I think. Yeah.
You're constantly innovating. What's your approach to R&D? How do you stay one step ahead of the game when your competitors are so fierce?
Yeah, look, I think it's you've got to be at the cutting edge of technology. I mean, there are things going on now with artificial intelligence within our R&D department where we're able to create experiences that you could only dream of in terms of interactive experience. So I think, if you're not at the cutting edge, you're really not going to be competitive when it comes to developing intellectual property.
Let's talk about the broader LAI Group today. 9,000 employees across the business, $1 billion plus in annual sales. Walk us through the various divisions and sort of how you've grown it over the last 10 years in particular, with all the separate divisions and departments that now make up the broader group.
Yeah. Well, then, of course, you've got the Quadrant joint venture, which operates Timezone. We acquired the AMF bowling operation in 2019, and we changed the name to Zone Bowling. So that's part of the Teague group, and then also part of that acquisition was a brand called Kingpin, which operates in all the other major capital cities, but not yet in Perth. And then we developed a brand in Asia, which is operating in India and Indonesia at the moment, called Play and Learn, which is a kids entertainment and education. Doesn't actually have any arcade games. It just has electronic interaction devices that kids can learn from. And that's got about 50 units operating in India and Indonesia. So that's the Teague brand. And then we have the Embed brand, which I explained earlier. Embed started because we had a need for a payment system. That now operates in, I think, 59 countries, in over 3,000 venues around the world, and is the leading supplier of card payment systems and management systems for the family entertainment centre industry. And then you've got LAI Games, which we've referred to, which started in the 80s and is now a major designer, developer, manufacturer and distributor of arcade games. And the last business entity is called Arcade XR, and that runs a website platform called arcadeonline.com. And that's designed to bring the arcade or the family entertainment centre industry to the online market. Because if you look at, I mentioned before that in 1976, 100% of interactive games were played in arcade or FECs. And today it's 10% because 90% of the business is online. So we have warehouses in Osborne Park and Singapore, where we've got all games set up connected to the internet with microphones and sensors. And so you can play a real arcade game and win real prizes like you do at Timezone online from anywhere in the world. In fact, although we call them farms, these warehouses, the farms are located in Ausbiz Park in Singapore, but 70% of our customers are in the US. So if you go into our warehouse at 3 o'clock in the morning, it sounds like Timezone at a peak trading period, because you hear all these bells and whistles are going off, the machines are all operating, there's nobody there.
Just in terms of the expansion of the group, when have you known and what have you looked for when acquiring a business versus growing organically?
We have acquired a few businesses. I mentioned we acquired the business of Ardent Leisure back in 2019. We've acquired several other businesses. You know, I think the main criteria is whether it's a direct fit with what we're doing. You know, we don't acquire other businesses and then switch them into what we're doing. You know, they've got to be reasonably successful in our particular market segment. And we're still looking out for that. We're looking at acquiring a significant business at the moment in the Middle East that's in this industry. So, yeah, that's a major part of our growth drive.
Before we move on to the foundation and philanthropic matters, where else do you see opportunity privately to invest capital? What sort of interests you outside of the sectors that you're already exposed to?
Well, we through Derek's Forpurpose Ventures fund, we're the cornerstone investor, and we're very excited about the potential of the startup community in this country, particularly West Australia, as potential investments. And I find that very interesting, because when I stepped down in an executive capacity from the LAI Group 13 years ago, my son Adam was put in charge, and I realised then that the only way this was going to work is I had a butt out. So was after a few years, I decided to look at the opportunity of investing in business startups. And then fortunately, I met up with Derek, and we agreed to set up this new venture capital fund, which I put up the cornerstone investment. At that time, one investor was limited to 30% of the fund, and we were worried about whether we could get the other 70% raised, and we finished up way exceeding that. The fund raised $55 million in the end. And it's been a very, very successful operation. So I see a lot of potential to invest in the innovation ecosystem right now.
What drew you to Forpurpose Ventures, and walk us through some of the most successful businesses that you've invested in through that company?
Well, Derek will be able to tell you in more detail, but I think they've made 8 investments. They range, and so they're all progressing very well. They've all made significant progress in the 2 years since the first investment was made. One in particular I mentioned to you earlier that's in robotics. Forpurpose Ventures invested in it 10 months ago, and they've just got a new term sheet out which values the company at about an 8-fold increase on what it was 10 months ago. So that's an exceptional outcome, of course, but there is a lot of opportunity for these young founders that have great ideas. I always say that if you want to get into the mining or manufacturing business, you need tens or hundreds of millions of dollars in capital. But if you've got a really great idea and a laptop, you can create $1 billion enterprise in a decade. And Canva and VGW are 2 great examples of that. They've just celebrated their 10th birthday, and they're worth about $40 billion and $7 billion respectively. So there you go.
Amazing businesses. Yeah. Let's talk about the Malka Foundation, named after your grandmother, I think
you
said.
That's my favourite subject. Yeah.
What inspired you to start the foundation? What's its purpose? What do you want to achieve with it?
Well, when I stepped down in executive capacity from the LAI Group, I decided that I really needed to give something back to the community. So after family discussions, we decided that we're going to give a significant amount of the family's wealth away. So we formed a private ancillary fund called Malka Foundation, with the purpose of just giving money to general charities. And then through a mutual friend, Michael Angie, I was introduced to Jan Stewart, who just retired recently after 22 years as the CEO of Lotteries West here in WA. And I met with her and told her my intention, and she amazed me, at the demand for charitable donations relative to the amount of funds available. Actually, most people don't realise, but Australia is not particularly charitable. We give about 0.6% of our GDP to charity. New Zealand's at 1.6 and US is at 2.4. So whilst 0.6% of $2.5 trillion is a fair amount of money, it's very small compared to some other countries. So I decided that the best way that I could contribute towards humanity, if you like, is to help young people to create more wealth, because our research showed that only about 0.2% of the population build long-term sustainable businesses. And I don't count plumbers and electricians and doctors and lawyers. I'm talking about businesses that employ a lot of people and grow. So if we could increase that from 0.2 to 0.4, you literally double the size of the economy. And even if the charitable contribution was still only 0.6%, you double the output in that area. So we decided that 80% of the fund would contribute towards entrepreneurial education and seed funding, and 20% would be given to general charities. And that's the way it's operated for the last almost 6 years.
And what does that look like on a day-to-day basis for yourself and for the team at the Melker Foundation? Are they assessing potential business investments to invest in? Are they providing sort of educational courses or mentorship sort of days, or what does that look like?
Yeah, well, we don't encourage people to inquire. We go out and identify the charities that we want to help. And then we go out and identify the universities and schools and other areas that we want to put money into to help develop the education and seed funding process. So it's internal. We don't have a big staff. In fact, they're all part-time. We have Brad Owen, who's the financial administrator and manager of the foundation. Derek Gerard is the chairman, and Jan Stewart is the CEO, and they all work on a part-time basis, so our operating cost is pretty low. And that's probably because we only focus on organisations that we identify that we want to help, rather than making ourselves open to anybody that wants to approach us for help.
We were speaking earlier, obviously it's got a national focus, but particularly here in Western Australia, it's such an entrepreneurial place, such an entrepreneurial culture. How have you seen sort of Western Australian, the Western Australian business landscape evolve over the decades, and do you still see that thirst for entrepreneurship that seems to have always been here?
Yeah, well, look, to be quite frank, when we started on this venture with Melker in the entrepreneurial stage, I didn't have a lot of faith in the youth of the community, because most of the young people that I was associated didn't really show a lot of interest in entrepreneurship. But having got involved with the schools and the university, we started off with a high school here in Perth, and the principal was really enthusiastic. So we sent her off to America, and she found a learning franchise called Uncharted Learning, and she brought it back and introduced it to the school, and it was very successful. Then we got from there, we got introduced to other schools, including St Catherine's College, who were running a program called Bloom, which was doing similar things. And then we got introduced to Curtin University and started funding their entrepreneurial program. And more recently, things like Charlie Bass's Centre for Entrepreneurial Development and Innovation. We got involved with that about 3 or 4 years ago. And more recently, we've expanded our involvement at the tertiary level by signing agreements with the UWA Students Guild, Murdoch University, and the new Edith Cowan University campus that's going into the city here later this year. So we're very entrenched in the education and seed funding process, and we've also got an infrastructure to provide significant ongoing funding through venture capital, through Forpurpose Ventures. And of course, there are other venture capital companies that are starting to show a lot of interest in the West Australian development as well. So if, when Canva moved to Sydney, they did it for 2 reasons. One, they couldn't raise capital here in Perth. And 2, there was no infrastructure. They couldn't get coders and programmers and the people they needed to develop their programs. So they moved to Sydney. If that had happened today, that wouldn't happen, because the infrastructure is there. The capital, the venture capital is here. They could have built that business out of Perth and stayed here if we'd had the infrastructure that we have today.
What motivates you, in particularly with regards to your philanthropic endeavours? Why are you so passionate about giving back?
Well, because I believe that the quality of life is directly related to the amount of wealth generated by the community. We as individuals add value to goods and services, and that's called GDP. And I think that by contributing to that, I think I'm not only helping those in need, but also creating a better quality of life for those that are not in need or in less need. And I think that, we're only here for a relatively short time on this planet, And at 85, I know that probably better than anybody else. But I really think that's the objective in life. You know, it's the quality of life that counts, and it's the creation of wealth that contributes to that quality.
I thought we'd close off our discussion with a few more general questions. You mentioned before the evolution of Western Australia's economy from traditionally sort of a mining-based economy to now we're starting to see a lot of medical technology, financial technology, you know, technology more generally. How have you witnessed that dynamic change?
Yeah, well, look, if you look at the venture capital industry generally, and particularly Purpose Ventures, you know, none of those companies have significant capital bases. You know, they're all based on technology, and they're driven by the skill and will of the founder. Whereas, you know, in the resource industry and manufacturing industry, as I referenced earlier, you know, you need tens or hundreds of millions of dollars in capital. So I really think that there's a huge potential to develop this entrepreneurial innovation ecosystem market here in West Australia in particular, and in the country. I mean, West Australia accounts for, we're 10% of the population, and we account for 18% of the GDP because of the resource industry. But if you look at the venture capital market, we're only about 2% of the. And that's because the entire focus of economic development in WA has been on the resource industry. And now through changes in the last few years, that focus has also changed, and we're seeing a big growth in the innovation ecosystem.
What motivates you to wake up every day and still go to work and still be involved in so many different things?
Well, you know, being involved in Malka Foundation, I attend a lot of events that are put on by the universities and schools, and where they have things like pitch nights, and they have these young entrepreneurs, you know, pitching their products and services, you know, looking for capital and so on. I find that very inspiring. You know, it makes me wish I was 30 or 40 years younger, you know, because I see these young kids with great ideas, and all they need is, you know, financial support and advice, good advice, and they will build significant companies, you know. And I think that the rate of unicorn companies is going to increase quite substantially in the coming years to compared to what it has been historically, because of the availability of funding and education, particularly in Western Australia, that just wasn't there before.
When you look back at your business career, 21 pinball machines at 18 or 19 years of age to the size and the scale of the businesses that you run today, did you ever envisage that that would be possible, what you've done?
Oh no! I mean, when I started in business in 1958, my target was to achieve $100,000 a year in sales. So I mean, you know, $1 billion business wasn't even thought about or even conceived as possible in those days. But it, you know, it evolves like any other business. Once you get to your target, and you see, well, there's a lot more growth here, we can grow the business. So that's just an evolutionary process. But certainly, I never expected it to grow the way it has.
What would you consider your proudest achievements?
Oh, look, I think, you know, there's an international industry association based in the US. And in 2009, they gave me a Lifetime Achievement Award. And at the time, and I still am the only non-American to ever receive that award. And in 2023, I was an inaugural inductee into the Industry Hall of Fame, which is through the same US-based organisation. So they're the two proudest moments of my life, because, you know, I was recognised as being a major player in the industry, which made me feel pretty good.
65 plus years in business. What are the keys for success in your view?
Look, I think the keys for, we have a philosophy called the WIN philosophy, which is WIN being an acronym for watching out for opportunity and recognising it when you see it. Because there's opportunities that pass by every day, you just don't see them. And then the I represents immediately taking advantage of those opportunities and preparing a business plan which involves the people who are going to help you achieve your ambitions, the people that are going to help you fund the development of your business, and a very well thought out and designed business plan that you can faithfully execute. When I say faithfully execute, because the best ideas for economic development fail, and I can tell you some stories about business that were publicly listed at hundreds of millions of dollars and still went bankrupt because management failed to execute the business plan. So I think the secret is in the founder, their will to succeed, their ability to develop a business plan, their ability to get buy-in from the people that are going to help and finance them, and then the N stands for urgency. Once you've got that I section of the thing in place, you've got to go full steam ahead immediately. Never procrastinate on the implementation of those plans. And that's been my philosophy, and it's worked for me, and I've seen it work for several others as well.
When you've been confronted with challenges over the years, how have you been able to overcome them?
Well, I've had a few. I've been bankrupt twice, or almost. I had an altercation with the tax office back in the 80s, which went on for several years before they withdrew the assessments that they made. And then we found out the reason they'd stalled it was because they thought there was some liability. And we couldn't get any compensation because the statute of limitations had expired. And then I had another issue where I had a fairly extensive bank loan with Bank West, and they were taken over by another UK bank, and they decided they didn't like our business, and they just told me pay it all back, So that put a lot of pressure on me at the time, and I managed to talk my way out of that one. But look, it's life. It hasn't always been uphill. We've had a few trials and tribulations, but fortunately we've got through them and we've managed to succeed.
What about Australia's future? What do you see are the opportunities on the horizon that Australia as a country needs to take, and what are some of the long-term challenges that Australia needs to overcome to be successful?
Well, look, I think Australians, when it comes to innovation, our young high school students and uni students are just as smart as they are in the US and other fast-growing economies like Singapore, Israel, Finland, Estonia. These are all really rapid-growing economies. But I think the limitations are, we as a country, we need to be more competitive. For example, in the US, the corporate tax rate is 21%. And if you want to, if you're prepared to go there and start a new business, they'll give you a concession rate of 15%. Whereas here it's 30%. So that's not competitive, Energy costs in Australia are 50% higher than they are in the US. And I can compare other countries as well. Infrastructure to support economic development is nowhere near as abundant in this country. So I think the government of the day, whoever that might be, really needs to look more seriously at economic development and make sure that there's infrastructure in place to support these young people who want to build enterprises and succeed. That's where I think our drawback is. I think America and other countries like those that I just mentioned are far more focused on entrepreneurial development than we are. And I think, in time it'll happen because we'll have to be. Otherwise, we'll lose capital because capital will flow to the countries where the best economic investment opportunities are.
Final question. What's left for Malcolm Steinberg to achieve? What else do you still want to do before over the next, say, 5 or 10 years?
Well, look, I'm very focused on Malka Foundation because I really think that can make a significant contribution to the community and humanity in general by raising wealth levels. So that's going to be my main focus. I'm not really that interested in other areas because I find that very satisfying and rewarding in seeing other people succeed. And particularly when, that robotics company I mentioned, the founder, she's been in business 2 years. She's only 24 now. How inspiring can that be to see young people like that, making a huge difference in the world? So that's where I want to focus my attentions. I'm 86 this year. I'm 85 now. I don't know how long I'll be able to continue in that endeavour, but as long as I'm capable, that's where I intend to focus.
I did say final question, one more. Where do you spend your time outside of work? How do you sort of stay inspired? What keeps you busy?
Well, look, I'm pretty interested in current affairs and politics, which I wish I wasn't because I find it pretty frustrating. But I spend a fair bit of time doing a bit of research in that area through the media. I've got 8 grandchildren. So I like to follow their progress. They've all done pretty well. 3 of them are living overseas now. The youngest is 21, the oldest is 30. So they're all much pretty grown up. But I certainly like to get involved with their progress and generally spend time with the family when I can, which is both my wife and I enjoy very much.
It's a good note to finish on. Malcolm Steinberg, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.